This is the InfoMed Consulting Podcast, a show where we have engaging conversations with individuals in the medical technology industry. Sit back and enjoy. Hello and welcome, Bart. Thank you so much for joining me. You're quite a distinguished man, so I'm very looking forward to speaking to you today. How are you?
Thank you for calling me a distinguished man. I'm trying to be as humble as possible since I left my corporate career, but I'm doing well. I'm very active at the moment because a lot of things are happening, which relates to my main focus.
Okay, that's great. That's great to know. And are you? I think you mentioned that you were in Germany somewhere,
I'm
in a
in
nice little
Berlin.
city.
I'm in the city that doesn't like walls. And
So it explains why you're doing what you're doing, in a sense, right?
it
In a
definitely is because I
metaphorical
think
sense.
that's why I mentioned it. We don't like walls in Berlin, and for some reason, a lot of people are building digital walls everywhere around life-saving knowledge, and I think we have to rethink that what we're going to build. Because we are
Yeah,
building again nice asymmetric power relationships worldwide, which have nothing to do with what the future promises of that technology that we have available for us all.
yeah. If someone just joined in now, that already like 2 minutes in, that's very deep and like philosophical. Can you maybe take a few steps back and just explain to us, who you are, and you mentioned just now something about leaving your corporate life. Can you just maybe give us an
Yes.
introduction of Bart? Yeah.
Yeah, so my name is Bart de Witte. I live in Berlin, but I'm originally from Belgium, Antwerp. I moved around. I lived in different European countries, but I was quite a long time in corporate functions. At the end, in executive roles at IBM for the last 10 years. I always worked on the intersection of technology and healthcare because I am a nerd and I use a lot of technology myself, and technologies that what allows people to get or what empowers people. Like I think a person who has now in Africa access to a marathon, which costs $58, has more access to information as Bill Clinton had when he was a president. So that kind of relates to my dream of empowering people through technology. But in healthcare, the last 20 years, a lot of digitalization projects have happened, but I think we saw it really well during the COVID crisis. Inequality is really a thing in healthcare, and it is not being solved through technology. Yeah, that's why I left my corporate career and I try to solve the inequality equation by creating an open source movement in healthcare that is connected to data and artificial intelligence.
Okay. So is it fair to say that at the moment data is being used as a commodity in healthcare? Is that where the inequality comes in?
Yeah, that's where definitely the inequality will be in the future. A lot of people will say like data is not a commodity, and then I ask myself the question: then, well, what are the acquisitions then from 4-year-old startups, like for example Flatiron, which was a startup that collected 2 million oncology records, and that was in 4 years' time able to being sold for 2 billion, 2.1 billion to a big pharma company. And I said like there was not a lot of revenue generated within that startup. They didn't have a huge profit margin, but that definitely was a data acquisition. So similar to the acquisitions that we saw with WhatsApp being bought by Facebook, which was a $19 billion acquisition. So these acquisitions are kind of what we see as a consolidation of data through capital. And what you definitely see is that data accumulations are following capital concentrations. So that's what you see. There was definitely a path going towards data commodification, mostly driven by US centric companies.
Okay. And is it just the money thing? Like why would people not want to think of open source models when it comes to data sharing and information sharing?
Well, if you
Is it
look
just
at
a
all the
profit-driven game?
yeah, but like it's kind of what the it's kind of how do you create a business, and if you make something scarce that actually hasn't been scarce, you create what we call artificial scarcity, and by building walls around that data, you create economical value. So you kind of make something scarce, and like with the oil price, if you don't push enough oil out there, then oil prices go up. But you make it scarce by not producing as much oil as is needed. So if you kind of create these same kind of barriers, you are able to capitalize on the scarcity that is available. So that means that um, if you implement it in healthcare, you can create a lot of economical value in that sense by making something scarce that actually isn't scarce. And that's kind of the main principle that a lot of investors are aiming for by making something scarce and hoping to create huge profits out of that.
And when we talk about this data in healthcare, right, just to get a clear understanding of what you're saying, are we talking about the actual, for example, source code or design ideas and that sort of thing? Like, what are we actually talking about when we, especially for healthcare and medtech?
Well,
What are we trying to open source, for example?
Well, I would say, like in a simplistic way, it is
Yeah.
we want to open source the statistical relationships in huge data sets, because it's not about my individual data as a person that you want to open source, so my personal data becomes open to all others to see. That is not what we want to open source. The
Okay.
open sourcing is the creating huge cohorts of data that have really valuable statistical relationships that we then can also open source, which in healthcare you call biomarkers. So you kind of have in that data sets specific data points that can allow you to predict the onset of a disease, or is a biomarker to see that kind of therapy would fit to your profile. That's what we try to open source, like really the insights out of the data. But of course, to open source it, you need to open the data first, and then open source
Yeah.
the insights that you get out of it. So we open source the data, but as well the extractions that you get out of the data.
Okay. And there has to be some sort of, approval from the users, right? Because if we're collecting data from people, so how does that work in this whole landscape? um, you know is what if I don't want my data to be shared in open source? Do I have the choice to not give it away?
Well, yes, we have something what is called informed consent. So everybody needs to give their consent when data is being processed. Normally, if you give consent, you allow people to process that data for that specific reason that you gave consent. In healthcare, they say like, do you want to give your data for research, which is such a broad description.
Yeah.
But um, um,
Yeah.
what is research? But if that research leads to a drug that you can't afford yourself, why should you give your data and donate it in that sense? If then the extractions are being privatized and not available, so there is a huge gap in what is really consent and what is really informed consent. And informed consent has to do with the data literacy of the subject, the person that gives his consent. Does he really understand the concept of data? But it's also connected to how is the design of the consent form. And we all know when we download an app and we look at the terms and conditions
No one
of
reads
the app,
that.
nobody reads that. And it's designed that way that you don't read it. Because if you would read it and if you would understand it, then the company would not have as much people accepting it. So it is kind of a gap in there. We need to fill that gap with and empower patients to get more insights in that what they really agree on. Because if you would do that on a paper-based level, a lot of people would understand it. Like if, for example, there was a time where messaging was not encrypted, and like WhatsApp wasn't encrypted at the beginning, and people were sending very intimate information through these channels, and then the companies were allowed to use that data and read that data. And it's like, okay, imagine now the same process on a paper-based level, and then somebody opening up your letters and reading that and selling that information for other users. Would you allow that? I said, no, I would never allow
Mhm.
this. But in the digital world, they would, because they have this really disconnection between what is the old world and what is that new digital world. There is not a lot of
And I think
educational awareness.
yeah, exactly. I was just going to say that because we're always quick to talk about digitizing the world and putting in place like all these really cool digital systems. But I think with that comes a huge burden of educating people on what is actually data and how is it actually moving from one place to another. I think there's really not a good understanding of that. And like you said, the whole encryption issue is a good example with WhatsApp and with any sort of communication platforms. How do we educate the world on understanding the value of data and the meaning of data? Is that part of what you're trying to do as well?
Definitely, we are we have, and I can explain that later. We have tested social media campaigns where we used visual filters to create awareness. But I think what I also feel is that there is a lot of lack of education in historical context. For example, the data protection and data privacy was being looked at as a very boring topic. Why do we? There was a time where a lot of my friends said privacy is dead, and I said like, how can you say that? Like it's one of the things that our grandfathers fought for. It's a human right, a fundamental right that we suddenly achieved, and then. It's like why, and it's like well, there is in the historical context, there is one example that I sometimes use is that there is a huge difference in the number of Jewish people that got deported from Holland and France. Like in Holland, there were
Hmm.
much more people, Jewish people being deported and died. And that was basically due because of the difference between the data protection in France and in Holland. There was a census database which was actually recording your name, your address, but also your religious background. And when the Nazis entered Holland, the first thing they did was really capturing these databases, so they knew exactly where people were living. In
Hmm.
France, they did quite a lot of effort to destroy these databases, and the difference is that so many people saved their lives because the information was not available. So that's kind of the dimension you need to think of
Mm.
in a historical context, that the access to your private data can mean that whatever comes in place as power in your government, and this is not a constant, it can always change rapidly, as we see now in the world, that things are rapidly changing, that these things, these elements are really important to protect. And that was in the analog world always the case. But
Yeah.
somehow, when we transfer from analog to digital, um, digital was kind of a copy of the analog world, but the only copy that we made was the economical part. But we didn't copy the
Right.
values and the culture and the norms and all
Yeah.
the things, because, yeah, why should I? Like it's about moving fast and breaking things. That was kind of the
Isn't it also
credo.
Bart? Isn't it also that it's difficult to transfer from analog to digital in those other dimensions? Because for example, you would have to, because you said that we've only transferred the economical aspect, which I agree with. Isn't it a bit difficult to transfer value systems through, from analog to digital? I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done because it's difficult, but isn't it one of those where they didn't look at that because they said, okay, well, it's too difficult and it's probably not that important anyway.
Yeah, and
You know.
that's what the European Union has been focusing on with the GDPR legislation. It is difficult. It came just 15 years too late. But it is really difficult, and it is then the balance of economic growth and protecting your citizens and balancing all these are really difficult tasks. But I think And what I'm trying to do is I've created an NGO which also tries to solve part of that, because I think um, if you allow data monetization and you allow
Mhm.
capital to be the only driver for creating these information asymmetries, which allow you to become more powerful or insightful in that case, then this is the base for future health inequalities, and we will not change anything in terms of health inequality, because the low income countries will stay poor in that sense in terms of access to information, as we have seen with medical publishing, for example. It's a perfect example. That's researchers in Africa cannot afford to buy a $40 research
Yeah,
paper, but they go to
that is
SciHub.
crazy to me. Yeah,
Yeah, but
yeah,
that's the same thing. That's the same thing. It was the medical publishing world was about accessing free access to journals. Then we translated to digital, and then suddenly uploading a PDF on a web server makes it a $40 per PDF business. That doesn't make any sense, but it is kind of what happened, and it created these huge inequalities in terms of access to knowledge, because all the universities in Europe can afford to pay these licenses, but as soon as you
yeah,
go outside of these Western countries, they don't have access
yeah.
to that. So they use Sci-Hub, which is a hacked version, and that woman, which is
Yeah.
for me
Yes,
a
yes. There's other
hero.
controversy. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on Sci-Hub
I
as an
think she's a hero.
open man, really?
Yeah, I think she's a
Because I
hero.
think, yeah.
Because she
No, go
gives
ahead.
access to live to whatever. I think the problem that she's now being sued with billions of dollars of a thing is kind of is a strange perception of our world, because it's people who building walls suddenly are the ones that are being protected, and people breaking down walls are the ones that are getting sued. 30 years ago, we thought very different about this. As I said, I live in Berlin. It took us a long time to break down a wall, and I think we need to start changing that perception, that if we design the future, why should we continue
Mhm.
on that old kind of colonial thinking, which is based on these huge in asymmetries? I don't I disagree with that kind of future design in that sense, because it's a
Isn't it?
design
Doesn't it
principle.
also doesn't it speak to something about part of human nature to always look for a way to selfishly gain? You know, it is because for a good example is Sci-Hub. Like you said, there was before you could access all these publications relatively easily and cheaply or for free or whatever. And when we transferred to digital, someone saw an opportunity and they said, "Oh well, I can actually put a paywall in front of this thing and generate some sort of income because there's like a need for power associated with that." Do you think that happens almost repeatedly? You know, it's something to expect almost that humans are always going to look for a way to find a selfish gain somewhere.
I would not generalize humans. I think it's a really small percentage of humans that are actually
You think
driving
so?
this. Yes, I think so. I did a recent survey in my network, asking if the extractions of data should lead to open knowledge, or should be leading to closed knowledge, like IP protected knowledge. And 80% of the people that answered that survey, and okay, it was a small survey, it was 350 people answering it, but 80% said like it should lead to open knowledge. Like, and the ones that wanted to have it closed were all my investor friends, the vice presidents, the ones that actually don't
Uh-huh.
do the handling, but are actually sitting on top of a hierarchy. And I think that's what kind of is the battle, the constant battle of kingdoms versus democracy, or it is really what the internet promise, that we suddenly are all connected and can create very different kind of organizational models, where it's not about hierarchy anymore, but it's really based on your skill set, and it's really what are you and what are you doing and what is the value that you can contribute. It's not about where are you sitting and how much power do you have, and that is kind of the constant battle. And of course there is governments. That was a long time I didn't understood that one, but governments are actually interested in companies generating profit because you can tax that profit, and the more profit is
Yeah.
generated, the more income you have as a
More
government,
tax. Yeah.
which is something we could witness in the vaccine discussions in Europe. There was the vaccine of AstraZeneca, which was sold as a non-profit in a kind of drug because AstraZeneca made a plate that they would sell it for the cost price, not a for profit price. So in the European Union, AstraZeneca closed an agreement with the European Union that they sold it for 1.5 euros a vaccine. And then you had the BioNTech and CureVac and the Merck Modern, which were sold for 15 euros a vaccine. And they were being prioritized because, of course, that generated a lot of profits that they could tax. And there was it's a really good, interesting documentary on this from BBC Two on that, that really deep dived into that system, how they chose to not select a non-profit or non-profitable drug and preferred the most expensive one. Um, 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 uh, Partly because of that, and I think that's the same thing with data, that a lot of people within the government think, oh, we have so much data in our healthcare systems. And then there are these consultants that come, you know what, you can earn 6.8 billion with your data a year. Then they say like, whoa, this is just going to give us additional funds and more power. And so it is the those who are in power that actually abuse these systems. But I think the majority of the people want something else, and I think that's what the constant fight is for control. In that
Battle.
sense, it's the same thing with cryptocurrencies. It's the same thing with a lot of these decentralized technologies that kind of take the power away of centralized organizations versus empowering people. That's what I said at the beginning. I love technology because it's about really empowering people. And I don't think it's the majority that wants that. I think the majority wants a different world. They don't they don't care about these things. They would just want to have
To
tools
make
for
power
themselves.
and profit.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, not
Okay.
only to make power and profit. I think if you look at the Maslow pyramid of needs, then people want security, and then after that, there are things that you can want. But it's I don't think all people are driven by that kind of greed and hunger for power, which always mostly leads them to abuse.
And it's so you're saying it's the people that are at the top of the food chain, in a sense, at the top of the pyramid, that are driving these efforts for not sharing data and information because they can see the monetization aspect of that.
They see the monetization aspect of that, and I think it's partly because they are don't have a good understanding of value creation and what technology is about. So if you look at healthcare, healthcare is always being based on a scarcity issue because yes, it took a lot of cost for developing drugs, and yes, that needs to be protected. So we see further investments. I totally agree with that view, but the world is changing. There is a company called In Silico Medicine who just put it their drug, which was fully developed by an AI system, to phase one clinical trial. We saw that during the vaccine discussions that clinical trials don't take 5 years anymore. It can be done in a very short time, and this is all through the digitalization efforts that we have been doing. So that means that the effort of developing drugs is not as costly as it was before, and it will become less and less and less and less and less and less costly. So that means that we have to also have a discussion on how long can these things be protected by IP, and we need to understand the future of value creation. And if you don't protect it so much by IP anymore, you allow other peoples to profit from these drug innovations. So you decrease health inequalities on a global scale. And I think that's kind of the chance that we can create something what we can call abundance of life-saving goods, versus the actual scarcity model that we drive. And then people ask me, when we do abundance, where are we going to earn our money? And I said, like, look,
I
if
was just going to
Gucci,
ask that.
yeah, if Gucci can sell clothes on the metaverse for $10,000 and people are buying this, and you think that in healthcare there is nothing that we can create, which creates additional value, which is connected to brand, experience, whatever, but is not connected to you get access to life-saving knowledge and you don't, but we create that one as a common layer that is available to all, but you allow the economy to differentiate on what I call the experience layer, where people are willing to pay perhaps a drug that has a print that looks like a Gucci drug and it costs just $2,000 to take it. People will buy that because they want to differentiate. But the substance in the inside would be the same. And I think we should have these kind of discussions because I think the JP Morgan recently released a report that the metaverse is a $1 trillion annual opportunity. If the metaverse is a $1 trillion opportunity,
Did you say
we
one
for sure
trillion dollars?
$1 trillion annual opportunity. Right? That's the JP Morgan
Okay.
report. Everybody can Google it, we'll find that report. If that is the case, then who will doubt that if we open source medicine for a part, if we don't monetize on data, we cannot generate a new layer that is totally inexistent at the moment that will create
Yeah.
a monetization layer.
I know this is just an example you're using, but I would say that it could be a bit contradictory and controversial, especially if you talk about the metaverse and meta, because on the one side, you're saying we can have a system where you don't have to worry about profit when you open source your data. But at the same time, you look at a company like Meta, where there's always these issues of how data is handled, and it's not always transparent. So you have these two opposite things of lack of transparency, but at the same time, you're proposing we could use this same model to open source. Can you maybe just connect
Mm,
those two?
Yeah,
Or
with
I know it's
metaverse, I
just an
don't
example,
mean
but
Meta the company.
yeah.
So there is a lot
Aha.
of
Okay.
metaverses out there.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
there
Sure.
is the
Sure.
Web
You just
3
mean
3.0. Yeah.
okay. Okay. My mistake. So you just mean that that model is a beneficial one if we do it correctly and transparently.
Yeah, the Web 3.0 is all about decentralization, and you have things like crypto, you
Okay.
have NFTs, you have different value leverage in there, and of course the Facebook kind of already tries to colonialize the term metaverse by calling themselves
Yeah.
Meta,
I
and
didn't
and
know. Yeah. I thought it
yeah,
was their
so
term.
no, they just hijacked it and call themselves "We are the metaverse," which is completely nonsense because there are so many other metaverses. The Linden Lab already created a metaverse 20 years ago. There are so many different metaverses out there. So yes, but if it would be Facebook, I would agree with your critical point that this would be a problem. That there is this one centralized organization that is all owning all the data, and then you would create value on top of it. No, that's not what I'm talking about when I use the word metaverse.
Okay. No.
Mhm.
That's a good
I'll
distinction
give you
to be made.
perhaps an abstraction that would help you. So imagine that we would
Hmm.
find a drug candidate and we put it under an NFT license. Like it is suddenly a non-fungible token that is the IP of that drug. But that means that everybody can still copy and use that drug design and produce their drugs because it's a common good, but somebody can still own it and say like I'm the owner. It's like art, like I'm the owner of an Picasso, but you have
Or music.
for music or whatever, but you're still owning that. And that can be there are collectors out there that say like, hey, I'm the owner of that drug that everybody is saving lives, but I'm not really owning it to make it scarce. I'm owning it to put myself on a pedestal and I can resell it and somebody else will buy it for a higher price, which is the kind of these collector mindsets. People want to collect and own something. But if you
Mhm.
can connect this to still allowing others to make copies of it and not having to pay for that, then you
Get
get
you.
a very different kind of system.
So if we had a system where you could essentially buy someone's IP, or no, not buy, but pay and have access to the IP so that they could replicate what the IP contains. Right? That's you're just talking about that, but in a digital type of world.
Yeah, yeah, and you don't build a wall so that not like with the medical publishing where they say "Hey,
Okay,
it's
yeah.
only $40." No, it should not have any paywall in that sense.
Okay, because a lot of the times when you hear discussions about open innovation and this kind of thing, the immediate thought is that it's anti IP, but you're not necessarily anti IP. You're just saying IP can still exist, but it's not. It shouldn't be what creates the value, right? The value shouldn't be that you have an IP and you're keeping it for yourself.
Open source is IP too. Like open source is a license that kind of gives the property to the common good. So it is a license model that is regulating the property of that source code and gives everybody access. So there's this huge misconception about open source in that sense, but it's
Yeah.
also an IP regulation. But just it tells that everybody can use it, and these are the rules how to use it. And if you apply with these rules, then this is how the IP is handled.
Okay. And let's talk a little bit about AI in healthcare, because that's your you said that that's your main focus. Can you
Mhm.
maybe just explain exactly how AI is moving in healthcare at the moment, and what you're trying to do in terms of opening that up?
Yeah, so I was at IBM as mentioned, and as everybody know, IBM had this really weird journey with Watson Health, and the first time when I saw the application of machine learning in healthcare, the promise was in 2010 when IBM had a project which was focusing on using data sets from high-end clinical institutes in Europe, and then uniting that data to build a clinical decision support system that was replicating the decision makings of doctors in HIV treatment decisions. And that decision engine was then made available for free for African doctors. So it was kind of an advisor for retroviral therapies for HIV treatments. And it was an EU funded project called EU Resist. And I suddenly understood, like, whoa, we have now the possibility to take data, take the best decisions worldwide ever been made, and replicate that power of decision making in regions where we have less trained doctors and empower them to have the same accurate kind of decision making. And that's like, this is so promising because it kind of is the technology for me that could equalize the access to expert knowledge on a global scale. And I make sometimes this joke that half of the doctors are worse than the average, um, but which is a normal Gaussian distribution. But it could be like that you have
Yeah, fair enough.
that you are have leukemia and you go to a doctor who only sees 4 patients a year, and you go to
Yeah,
another doctor who sees 800 patients a year, you probably will get a better outcome with that guy who sees 800 patients a year because
yeah.
healthcare is partly pattern recognition. So, and through his experience, he sees better patterns and takes better decisions. So, AI for me is really partly one part is really a tool that allows us to make better informed decisions and allows us to take the historical context out of data and allows us to scale this. The
I want to
problem,
just
uh,
stop you. I just want to stop you there on the AI as an assistive technology for doctors. I've I've spoken to a few doctors here and there. I want to know what your experience has been when speaking to doctors and healthcare professionals, because there's sometimes this perception that the AI will replace them, or that the AI will miss something, or something like that. Is there a gap that we need to bridge there in terms of actually presenting these types of technologies to healthcare professionals?
that
And explain
that
to them like we're not trying to replace you. You know, that's not the point.
well, I think there's a very complex question with a lot of dimensions. Like first of all, you
Okay.
can't replace something where there is no doctor. So if you look at um, if you look at Egypt during COVID, Egypt has 80,000 physicians registered. During COVID, 10,000 of the registered physicians left the country to fill the gaps in the US. So 10,000 out of 80,000. So Egypt has a sudden serious problem with brain drain. And I think a lot of African countries, I have statistics from Nigeria, they need to educate 10 physicians to get one that stays within the country. All the other ones are filling the gaps within the Western
Mhm.
countries. So, out of that
Wow. Okay.
context, telling that AI will replace something is completely ridiculous. Like because we perhaps have here a chance to skill up people
Yeah.
to do things that normally physicians would do to suddenly allow them to make the same kind of decision making a physician would do. That is very controversial, but it is more controversial to see the brain drain and not doing anything about it. Because there was a paper that I read that in Nigeria, if you want to have the same with that brain drain quote that they have now. So training 10 doctors for one to stay, and then seeing the
Yeah.
available public money that is available for educating physicians. It would take them 100 years to get on the same number of physicians per capita as Western countries. So are we going to wait 100 years, or are we going to use AI to augment people to make better decisions? So replacement is a luxury term that is about a Western view country. That doesn't make sense to talk about replacement when first you don't have anything at all. So I think
There's
it's a
no.
very
There's nothing there.
problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the first point. The second point is about yes, there is a huge problem when we apply AI on a global scale with data that comes from one single region, because you have huge biases. So the doctors that are afraid of applying an AI system that is closed and not transparent because it's protected by IP, and you can't see the training data that has been used, I'm always going to be skeptical because none of it has been peer reviewed and is been open and transparently published. So they don't know if that decision making system is really trained on the
Yeah.
biodiversity of their own patient population. So there is, in that context, a huge gap. There was out of the 150 FDA approved AI systems in the US, most of these systems only use data that comes out of two different clinical institutes. So they are completely biased, these systems. Now we see AI companies from Europe going to South America, and it's like, okay, South America has a European kind of context relation in that sense, but
Yeah.
what do you do with the indigenous people being then suddenly diagnosed by a system that's been trained on Caucasian, European, Western citizens? And so there is a lot
Wow.
of
Okay.
issues there. Like even an Asian person has a different kind of liver anatomy. For the simple thing of radiology, now MRI imaging and AI, if you don't have access to Asian data or data coming from these regions, and then you have a hospital in Berlin diagnosing that person on an AI system that's been trained on local data, you will discriminate these Asian people by giving them
Yeah.
a wrong decision.
Lit-
So, yes, there
It's
are
literally. Yeah.
many, many, many issues with the gap between. So, AI is not going to replace, hopefully, any of these doctors at the moment. And it's not about replacement, it's about changing that half of the physicians is worse than the average. So it is about really scaling the best expert knowledge, but doing this in an open, transparent way. And so this is about creating knowledge out of data and scaling that knowledge.
Yeah. Is there an opportunity to use things like digital twins? I heard of this concept a few years ago at a conference in Berlin, actually, and the CEO of Siemens Healthineers was talking about this project that they had where they wanted to build this model essentially where you could input data from from different nationalities, for example, and you could predict the clinical outcomes. So is that something that it's still in the industry? Like, is that something that we're doing along with all these AI solutions?
Digital twins is a concept that came out of predictive maintenance for machinery. So it comes from the industrial side. So you get
Yeah,
a machine and you can predict when they have to replace a specific element out of that machine so that that machine doesn't stand still for hours and then stops production. So that's where the concept of digital twins comes from. Applying now a concept that comes from the industry where a machine is owned by a company now to people and humans is very problematic because you're going to have to talk and discuss ownership. And
yeah,
if you
for
talk
sure.
about a twin, that means that this is a digital reflection of the self, the human in itself. And then bringing this concept without discussing ownership is really, really problematic out of my
I
side because
completely
you,
agree. In fact,
you,
I had a question at the conference. Sorry to cut you off. I had
yeah,
a
no, no.
conference, sorry, a question exactly on this. And I said, okay, well, this is great and stuff, but who would own this data? And then I don't remember what he said, but I don't think he answered the question, right? Because it's now these big companies once again are like owning all this data and building these predictive models, but we don't know what outcomes they're trying to predict, when there's no transparency there.
I know Bernd Montag, the CEO of Siemens Healthineers, and I had conversations with him. So, and they're trying to find a way to of course, build business and build and apply AI and have the investment. I understand that. The problem is that these concepts are going to be hugely problematic. And there is a company that kind of is a not healthcare specific. It's called Replica.ai. It is a company that came out of a story from a person, a machine learning engineer, who lost her friend. Uh, her friend died, and then she used all the WhatsApp and other communication messaging, and she created a chatbot that was replicating her friend, so she could still chat with her deceased friend. And then she created a company out of it called Replica AI with the promise that you can chat with yourself and get to know yourself better. So you are bettering yourself in communication skills. That's kind of the pseudo
Yeah.
promise. But if you look at the terms and conditions, that it's kind of a wolf in a sheep's coat, because what they are doing is asking you to donate data to train the
Yeah,
AI.
yeah,
But you look at the terms and conditions, you don't own the AI model of your own self.
yeah. Hmm.
I'm going to repeat it. You don't own the AI model of your own self.
It's the same
So you
with the twin, right? It's the same with the
it's the
twin.
same with the twin. You're going to give data, and then suddenly they are going to say, like, in 10 years, you're gonna like a predictive model of out of yourself, but you don't own that. That is highly controversial, because in the fundamental rights of the European Union, there is written that your body and parts of your body cannot be used for economical purposes. That is in the analog world. So you cannot cut off your limb and then sell it, or you cannot cut off your kidneys and then sell it. That was why this fundamental right was created. The body and the human body, from an ethical perspective, cannot be used for economical purposes. But in healthcare, what is the digital self is your digital body in a digital metaverse or whatever it is. And suddenly people are economizing on this and creating ownership models on this. And we are creating what I call digital slaves that can even predict your behavior, like Facebook also has a digital twin about yourself. They just know what you're going to watch and what you're not going to watch. It's a behavior model of yourself, but it's owned by Facebook. It's nothing else. It's digital twin is a marketing term that came from the industrial thing, and it sounds nice, but it's exactly doing the same as Facebook has been doing.
And I'm glad you've brought up the more legal side of things, the ethical side of things. So how? Okay, let me take one step back. With the analog model, like you rightfully said, it's illegal to use for someone to use any part of you to make profit, right? Now we go into the digital model. We know that regulation tends to not be at the same speed as technology, right? So when we interpret those regulations, there's a very blurred line when it comes to data, because one will say very simply that, well, data, I mean, it is a part of you, but it's not you, right? So it's not the same as you're selling your limb, because the regulations basically haven't accounted for the digital world yet. And how do we actually end up in a world where we can regulate data and AI? Is it possible?
I think I read this book from Armin Nasehi, who is a professor in sociology, and in his social theory about the digitalization, he said something very simplistic, which makes it points it really well, that digitalization is nothing else as a duplication of the world through data. And if you think about that, then in this concept, looking from a social theory perspective, then we should look at that duplication as the same norms and values as the analog world, because you are duplicating something that is where people live in. Like there was a consumer report from the US published in January, where in the generation Z, which is the youngest generation, 58% of the people felt much better online as offline.
Right.
58% felt better in
They
the
felt
online
better.
world, as in the offline world.
Wow.
So that
Do you
means
know
that
how they
already a lot
measured
of people,
the?
well, they did
How did they
surveys.
measure the better? Yeah.
Well, they did surveys about where do you spend your time, where do you feel more better. So these are kind of consumer surveys for looking at consumer behavior. But
Hmm.
this means that, and this is kind of logical. Like if you look at all the Instagram filters where people are communicating, looking very different, and of course they feel better, looking much more beautiful in that metaverse, because the Instagram is also some sort of TikTok, a metaverse, because that's not a real world, but
Yeah.
people spend a lot of time
And
there,
people
and
live in it. Yeah.
people
Essentially.
live in it. So we are kind of moving towards
Yeah.
the matrix in that sense. And the matrix is a good example, because in the matrix, people live the whole time in a virtual world which has
Yeah.
is controlled by an entity that um, gives you the perception of agency, but you don't have agency in that sense. And um, I think we are moving, and if we are creating a digital world, we need to really fight for these rights again, which all our grandparents have been doing, and we are allowing people to just create a feudalistic world that before democracy even existed, where there are kingdoms that rule by power, and there's nothing to do with democracy. So the whole trend of allowing users to control their own data and possess their own data, and I go further, possess the AI models trained on our data as a societal value, is something we need to fight for. And it's not going to come from the industry. It's not going to come directly from governments. It's going to come from civic movements and NGOs and other organizations that are fighting for this.
Isn't it also an issue of saying, for example, if I'm a AI developer and I'm just making the other argument. I agree with what you're saying for the most part. So I'm an AI developer and I come up with this really amazing AI and I spent maybe 10 years. What you're saying to me is that I should democratize my algorithm that I worked on for 10 years. So it again becomes this thing of like, I did it, it's mine, I own it, I want the power and the money from it. What incentive do I have to share with the world that IP? Why should it be yours? Because I mean, I made it. Why should I give you the rights to own it?
Well, you don't give me the rights to own your model. Your model can still be. You can also like you have Creative Commons by attribution licenses, which means that you always need
Mhm.
to attribute the creator, which is you then in that case. So you always will get that recognition. Now, for me, it's kind of funny. Like I left a well-paid career and then suddenly became I changed my name on Twitter. Suddenly, I'm a medical AI activist on Twitter. I started an NGO which does completely the opposite of everything what I've been doing before. Now people say, how are you going to ask my money? Like, how are you going to earn your living? You have family and everything else. I don't know. Um, but the more I start to become active, people start to ask me to speak about this, and the more people start to engage me and pay me for speaking about this, because I'm the kind of originator of this. So I think thinking that by owning and creating scarcity on that, and that's the only way again of financing that that creator aspect is a
Yeah.
limited view on what is possible. And I think
Yeah.
it is similar with music, that suddenly the music industry, who went through a lot of transformations, that these artists are getting much more money with live concerts and
Yeah.
being present, because they are still the creator, although the industry is earning tons and much more with their music as they, but they are also earning tons in that sense. So the music industry in total didn't went bankrupt or started earning less money, or the artists started earning less money. It is still moving in all elements, but I think that the driver of creating something
Hmm.
should not be money. It should be recognition, and if you have that recognition as a guarantee, you will get perhaps better jobs, better careers in the whole open source software movement. If you want to be
Hmm.
a good coder, uh, and you have really good code on GitHub that has been used by many, many, many people, you will get really good jobs because you contributed, and your code seems to be
Hmm.
so good that others want to have it. So it works
Yeah.
perfectly there. You don't have to always like that control and own things. That
Yeah.
doesn't make
It's a
always
good way
sense.
to it's a good way to look at it. And I think the mindset shift that needs to happen is embedded in the way society is built, right? Because we, for the most part, Western society is built on the free market model, and in the free market model, the scarcity, um, the scarcity issue, that's kind of what drives price and value, right? So if something is not there, or if you create a perception that something is not there, you can drive the price as much as you want, and that's kind of a big component of the free market. And now we're going to have to think away from that and think more, what's the opposite of scarcity, like sharing, and as opposed to trying to hoard. So I think there's going to be a interesting, challenging mindset shift for a lot of people.
Not, I don't think for a lot of people, for a few people, again, because if you look at the medical publishing world, the peer reviews don't get paid, the author doesn't get paid, and the ones who create the
I'm
profits
still
are the
waiting.
companies.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
I'm
that
still
that
waiting to get paid for my articles.
yeah, you're not gonna get paid. So and that's what I said. Like there is
Yeah.
an appropriation by small powerful entities and groups and capital, in that sense, that are, as in the way, that's what colonial thinking is about, thinking that by having access to capital to grab more digital property, and then owning that property, and then allowing only those who can afford to come on that property. In that sense, there is this huge invisible war on grabs for territory. In that sense, it's and I think I have no issues with, because I'm only talking about healthcare. I want to make that very clear. I have no
Mhm.
issues when Tesla owns an AI model on autonomous driving and doesn't share that. That is, I think, less problematic in that sense, because that's automotive. That's an industry. But if it
Okay.
comes to healthcare, and I think that's why I want to stress this, I think I come from Europe, and in Article 35 in Europe, we have a fundamental right to get access to healthcare. We are leading in giving everybody universal access to healthcare. Americans who live here in Germany tell me, like, I thought socialized medicine, as they call it in the US, was so bad, but actually you
But it's
really
so
have
good.
really good healthcare, and I don't get bankrupt. So and I think there are two things in in life. I think education and healthcare are kind of pillars for society that should be common goods in that sense. So I just want to stress this, that I'm not radically looking at all AI and
Okay.
all data for all industries, but I'm really focusing on that healthcare side.
Okay. And either way, I think when we want to solve problems in the world, it's good to have like this laser focus on one thing, because if you try to solve in all industries, then you end up just with too many things to aim at, and then you end up not aiming. So I think it is good that you say that you're focusing on healthcare, and then whatever comes out of it, maybe you can start applying that to other industries eventually. But
Yeah,
I agree with the yeah.
we now, like, we call something, what we call is data solidarity. So we what we did is with Hippo AI, which is named after Hippocrates, is to say people give us the consent to donate the data, and then we put a copyleft license, a new one on that data, which is the Hippo AI license, which is not public anymore, not yet public, for the simple reason that the European Union is still defining a lot of things, and I don't want the industry lobby to destroy the possibilities what my license can do. So we are still in a kind of stealth mode, but the license itself would say like that the data and all the derivate products out of the data needs to be published under that same license, and the source code of the AI model trained on our data needs to be open. So we connect kind of open source licensing for code with open source licensing for databases, and make it one kind of open ecosystem. And we always focus too much on the patients, but this only will work if the industry accepts that license model. And I'm really, one
Mm-hmm.
of my main targets was to convince a big pharma company to join our first project, which focuses on breast cancer. And then people say, you got to convince a big
And
pharma to share data under that license model. Good luck with that. And I managed to
how
do
did that
so.
go?
I managed, AstraZeneca is joining our project, and they are donating us data that they never opened before. And they have a very different mindset. They say, like, it doesn't make any sense to follow that road that everybody is using capital to buy data, because it's going to end wrongly. R&D costs are going to go up because the commodity price of data is going to go up. R&D costs are going to go up, and that's not their core business. They said, like, we want to
Yeah.
have a different kind of view. And it took 6 months internally, with it's a mindset thing, to change the mindset of people, and they are just doing a baby step with us. And we are now discussing with other pharma companies to join, and we want to kind of create an example that if patients, doctors, and industry all share, we can create an open ecosystem of data in AI models for breast cancer, and then start really finding value within that ecosystem. But Google cannot
Hmm.
participate unless they would, if they access our data, they would open their algorithms, which they never will be doing, because that's
Yeah.
exactly what their USP is about.
Yeah. And so your mission really is to, apart from doing the actual work, part of your mission is to actually raise awareness and convince people to change their minds. So if you were president of the world for a year, what would be your three main messages, to address these issues? And we can even keep it to the healthcare industry, you know. But you're like the president, so everyone can hear what you have to say, you know. What would be like your three pillars as a president?
Uh, Coming back to the learnings out of history, I would first work on the educating people about why. Without the people understanding the why, it's going to be very difficult to go to the next step. So I think literacy is the first thing I would work on. Is really changing the education programs and adopting them to the 21st century, in that sense that it is not about consumerism of digital. It's really about empowering people to understand the real tools that allow them and empower them to brew their own beer instead of only drinking beer. So that would be the first thing, is really focusing on education, and also history, and for example, it is important that healthcare should be equally distributed, because there's a lot of papers that if healthcare is not equally distributed, your society is getting unstable and mechanic, something you can witness in the US. So um, concentration of power is something we need to absolutely avoid in healthcare. Imagine now, okay, it was good that we could perhaps switch off SWIFT in Russia, but imagine if we can switch off healthcare in a whole country based on these huge information digital asymmetries. That's for me a scary model. So the second thing would be then to really set up a strategy that decentralizes power and decentralizes yeah, healthcare power and knowledge in that sense. So I would create policies that would kind of leverage the decentralized technologies, and I would demonetize data, and I would force an open strategy in healthcare in that sense. So it would be about avoiding the asymmetric information or the information asymmetries that are there. So that would be the second one. And the third one, I would really enforce then based on that new common layer of common digital common goods, which are then the data commons and the AI commons, to reinvent the economy based on new principles that say like we are going to create a very different kind of economy that is based on experience. We perhaps allow Gucci to produce luxury pills, and if people want to afford it, that's fine. But everybody get access to the pills. If they want to use only 1.01 cent of their budget to buy the same product as the luxury, which costs 10,000, that is totally fine. And so I would try to kind of rethink the economy, and I am all for growth in that sense, but the there should be more digital common goods, like Wikipedia is a digital common good, and I think we should in healthcare the internet is a common good. Like the whole internet was created on open source protocols and open source technologies. 90% of the web servers used to be Linux. Now I think Microsoft is catching up on this. But um, so I would create next to the information network, which was the internet, a knowledge network that actually gives people access to the knowledge that allows them to build new innovations.
Great. Sounds like a great world. Maybe one day we'll hopefully we get closer and closer to that, because I think the it was clear obviously that the pandemic exposed a lot of healthcare inequalities, and now we have to do something about it, right? We can't pretend like those inequalities aren't there. So it's good that there's people like you really trying to push movements like this to equalize the world really in the healthcare industry. I think it's a great vision.
And yeah, and thank you for that. And it's really a hard vision. So I can all use all the your listeners. I can always use the support to visit us, and we are
Yeah.
creating a global ambassador concept. So what we by the end of the year is going to launch,
Hmm.
that somebody can create a Hippo AI community in South Africa and start using these principles. We are all about open source. We're gonna create frameworks and things that people then can apply. So it's about really grassrooted, connecting people through local communities that globally cooperate to make this happen. It will never happen when I become the president of the world. I think we need to do this. That's not my ambition either. I think we need to really do this grassrooted and connect and build together. There is so much beautiful things happen during COVID in the open source world. People
Yeah.
started to using open source designs for 3D printing. This 3D printing is a decentralized technology, and I was part of a group and a movement that in 8 weeks' time we created a Facebook group. We had 80,000 members in that group in 8 weeks' time, and there was a research paper that looked at it. After 8 weeks, that group created 1 million of 3D printed goods that were open source designed. Within 8 weeks, in 42 countries, 80,000 people collaborated on open source and produced goods. Like, this is the future.
And I mean, if it would have taken in the normal model, it would have probably taken like 2 years or something to produce that same amount of goods.
Yeah, it
So
would have taken
there you
probably
go.
100 million of invest to get there, and this was all for free. This was purpose driven.
Yeah,
This
this
is
is yeah, this is why we need the open innovation model. Absolutely. And finally, if we want to find you or connect with you, you know, if someone wants you to speak at some conference or event, how do we reach you? Do you have a platform where we can? You mentioned Hippo. I didn't hear it before.
hippoai.org is it comes from Hippocrates, Hippo AI. So
Yeah,
the new foundation, Hippocrates, was the ethical foundation for modern medicine. But also Linux and a penguin, and I said like a hippo is a nice animal to have as a symbol because hippopotamus is an animal that protects their children. So you don't want to meet these animals in nature because they are really dangerous, and they are only dangerous if you come
yeah,
close to their children. So they are kind of, for me, future generation thinkers, and that's why we chose Hippo AI as a name. So hippoai.org, or if they want to book me as a speaker, bartdewitte.com is my speaker website, and then people can just
yeah.
connect to me, or LinkedIn. But I
Right.
hate platforms, so better to go on the websites.
I'll add those details to the video. Bart, it's been so good to talk to you. A big thank you. I have to thank Mr. Pierre Longchamp for talking to me about you, and he said you have to speak to this guy. So very big thank you to you, Pierre. And Bart, it's been so good having you on, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Javi, and thank you, Pierre, as well, for bringing us together. I love this talk. So let's spread out this message that it's all about the mindset. We need to change the mindset of people together.
I almost thought you were going to say it's all about the money. It would have been a funny way to to end.
No, it is a
It's all
mindset.
about the
Like,
mindset.
we are in the times of war again in Europe because of a mindset of scarcity on oil and gas. Is that what leads not doesn't lead to peace? If we want to create
Yeah,
world peace in that sense, let us stop that crazy mindset and replicate this in the digital world. That doesn't make any sense.
yeah. No, I completely agree. Bart, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much. And
Thank you,
hopefully we
Javier.
speak again soon.
Hopefully we see each other soon again.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you for joining us for this engaging conversation. To find out more about InfoMed, visit infomed-consult.org. See you next time.